For what purpose does the gentleman from Massachusetts seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, by direction of the Committee on Rules, I call up House Resolution 779 and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the resolution. Does the gentleman intend to call up House Resolution 781?
Yes, I do.
The clerk will report the resolution.
House Calendar number 68, House Resolution 781, resolved that upon adoption of this resolution, it shall be in order to consider in the House the concurrent resolution, House Concurrent Resolution 83, directing the President pursuant to Section 5C of the War Powers Resolution to terminate the use of United States Armed Forces to engage in hostilities in or against Iran. All points of order against consideration of the concurrent resolution are waived. The amendment printed in the report of the Committee on Rules accompanying this resolution shall be considered as adopted. The concurrent resolution as amended shall be considered as read. All points of order against provisions in the concurrent resolution as amended are waived. The previous question shall be considered as ordered on the concurrent resolution as amended to adoption without intervening motion or demand for division of the question, except 2 hours of debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs. Section 2. Section 7 of the War Powers Resolution 50 United States Code 1546 shall not apply during the remainder of the 116th Congress to a measure respecting Iran.
The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized for 1 hour.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And for the purposes of the debate only, I yield the customary 30 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Dr. Burgess, pending which I yield myself such time as I may consume. During consideration of this resolution, all time yielded is for the purposes of debate only, and I ask unanimous consent that all members be given 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks.
Without objection.
Madam Speaker, yesterday the Rules Committee met and reported a rule, House Resolution 781, providing for consideration of H-Con Res 83 under a closed rule. The resolution also provides 1 hour of general debate controlled by the Chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs. Madam Speaker, the question before us today is very simple. Should President Trump be allowed to send the United States hurtling toward war with Iran without prior congressional approval? It is a question we must wrestle with following the President's actions last Thursday. That's when he ordered the lethal drone attack on Iraqi soil that killed Iranian General Soleimani. The outgoing Prime Minister of Iraq has said this strike was carried out without Iraqi permission or knowledge. It was done without any plan for the consequences in the region or the world. And more troubling still, it was carried out without any input from the people's representatives here in Congress. Think about that, Madam Speaker. Just a month ago, Iran was staring down some of the most intense anti-government protests in a decade. Thousands took to the streets in Tehran to express growing frustration and anger with their leaders. But what a difference a month makes. Protesters, men, women, and children have again taken to the streets of Tehran. Only this time, their anger wasn't directed at their own leaders. It was directed at the United States of America, all because of the President's unilateral decision. That's what happens, Madam Speaker, when monumental decisions of war and peace are made in a vacuum with no regard for the consequences. Things usually don't go very well. Rather than protect our national security and stabilize the region, President Trump's reckless decision to strike Soleimani united Iran. It has led to retaliatory strikes on 2 bases used by U.S. and coalition forces in Iraq, and it has put our troops and diplomats serving overseas in greater danger. Now, make no mistake, this decision has endangered all Americans everywhere. Hardliners are emboldened. 4,000 more U.S. troops have been deployed to the region. Operations against ISIS have been suspended. The Iraqi parliament has voted to kick American troops out of Iraq, all because of the brash decision of one man, the President of the United States. Madam Speaker, there is no question that Soleimani was a ruthless military commander. He had American, Syrian, Lebanese, Iraqi, and Yemeni blood on his hands. But that is not up for debate today, nor is the question of whether or not killing him was a good or bad idea. The President of the United States assassinated a high-level foreign military commander without asking or even notifying Congress beforehand. With little evidence, the President claims his actions prevented an imminent threat. But, Madam Speaker, the American people have heard that one before. We remember the stories about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. We remember the tens of thousands of American soldiers who paid the price for that deception. Madam Speaker, is this Congress going to sit by and allow that to happen in Iran? Or are we going to ensure that this body acts before a war begins that could continue long after President Trump leaves office? Now, the Constitution is clear. It is crystal clear. Article 1, Section 8 gives Congress the power to declare war. But President Trump treated Congress as if it were an afterthought and a decision that has destabilized the region and shaken the world. More than 4,000 of our brave men and women are now being sent to the Persian Gulf, all without any input from the People's Chamber. We represent the brave young men and women who are deploying to Kuwait. We represent those deploying to Iraq, and we represent those deploying elsewhere across the Middle East. Each of us speaks for them, and we speak for their families who are scared sick as their loved ones receive orders to deploy. Madam Speaker, we must summon the courage to be their voice. Now, I'm glad that the United States and Iran have taken a step back from the brink of war. But what we heard from the President yesterday was more of the same bluster. It's clear, even after the briefing by the administration yesterday that many of us attended, that he has no clue at all, none, about what could come next. Now, make no mistake, the world is less safe because of President Trump's chaotic foreign policy. The impacts of his strikes are still reverberating in the region and across the world, and we cannot sit silently by. The Constitution makes the President commander-in-chief, but gives only Congress the power to declare war. The founders knew that decisions of this magnitude require consultation between the branches of government. No matter who is in the White House, no matter who controls the majority on Capitol Hill. Now, Democrats don't want war with Iran. Most Republicans don't want war with Iran. And the American people certainly don't want a war with Iran. I think that would be catastrophic. We should be stopping costly, endless wars, not creating new ones. But whatever you believe, have the courage of your conviction. Have the courage to vote. And that is what the underlying War Powers Resolution is all about. Congress needs to authorize any additional hostilities with Iran. Madam Speaker, these decisions aren't easy. I understand that. There is no more consequential vote than deciding whether to send men and women off to war and into harm's way. We weigh that decision knowing that despite our hopes and prayers, lives are lost in combat. Mothers and fathers could lose their children. Kids could be forced to grow up without a parent. But when we were sworn in, each of us took an oath to defend the Constitution, and that means wrestling with this very tough decision when necessary. The only question now is whether we have the guts to uphold that oath. Madam Speaker, with the Middle East held captive to the whims of a reckless president, and with the commander-in-chief without a clue, I pray that we in Congress have that courage. On behalf of our troops, their families, and the American people, I urge my colleagues to support this rule and the underlying resolution. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank Mr. McGovern for yielding me the customary 30 minutes, and I'll yield myself so much time as I may consume.
Without objection, the gentleman may proceed.
Today, we consider House Concurrent Resolution 83, or technically we're considering the rule to consider House Concurrent Resolution 83, a resolution to remove the United States Armed Forces from hostilities in Iran. But the thing is, we're not engaged in hostilities in Iran. Once again, we are considering a measure that will have no force of law. This is a non-binding concurrent resolution. There was some debate in the Rules Committee last night on whether a concurrent resolution under the War Powers Resolution is in fact non-binding, but in the Senate, a joint resolution has been introduced, making it likely that this House concurrent resolution will go no further than the action today. The Constitution grants Congress the power to declare war. The Constitution also designates the President as the Commander-in-Chief of the armed forces. This sets up a conflict. The courts have not delineated the boundaries of these authorities or determined the gaps between them that would either deny power to a president or to the Congress, one at the expense of the other. Federalist number 69, Alexander Hamilton, argued that the president's power resides only in the direction of the military as placed by law at his command. Presidents have long argued that their role as commander-in-chief, coupled with their inherent authority over foreign affairs, grants them the power to engage the armed forces, short of war, as they see fit. Since the founding of our country, the Supreme Court has ruled both that the president enjoys greater discretion when acting with respect to matters of foreign affairs, and that absent an authorization of action during wartime, any action by the president was void. Despite the struggle to maintain the separation of powers with regard to engaging our armed forces, the motivation underlying the inclusion of the Constitution for these powers for both the President and the Congress continues to this day. The desire to protect and defend the United States, its persons, and its assets. Congress passed the War Powers Resolution in 1973, largely in response to the experiences in Korea and Vietnam. The War Powers Resolution authorizes the engagement of the forces of the United States in hostilities when there's a declaration of war, or there exists a specific statutory authorization, or a national emergency created by attack upon the United States, its territories or possessions, or its armed forces. To assess the current situation, let's examine what has led us to this point. In June of 2019, Iran shot down a surveillance aircraft that was flying over international waters near the Strait of Hormuz. This was an unmanned aerial drone. At the time, President Trump was advised by his military advisors to strike back. But the president opted not to strike back because it would have resulted in Iranian casualties, and he felt he could not justify creation of human casualties because of the loss of a machine. I agree with the president in that decision. I think his restraint was remarkable, but certainly exemplary. In December of 2019, Iranian cruise missiles struck nearly 20 targets of critical energy infrastructure in Saudi Arabia. This disrupted a significant portion of Saudi oil production. In December of 2019, Iranian-backed forces in Iraq targeted military facilities where United States forces were co-located. On December 27th, an Iranian-backed Hezbollah group, the U.S.-designated foreign terrorist organization, attacked a base in northern Iraq, and they killed a U.S. contractor and wounded 4 U.S. service members. The United States responded, and it launched a retaliatory airstrike in Iraq and Syria. On January 2nd, 2020, acting on intelligence of imminent threat to American interests and in response to the persistent attack by Iranian-backed entities, the United States military killed General Qasem Soleimani. Soleimani was the longtime leader of the Iran Revolutionary Guard Corps, the Quds Force. The Iran Revolutionary Guard is a U.S.-designated terrorist organization. It has been supporting proxy forces throughout the Middle East and attacking United States interests and allies for over a decade. Soleimani previously operated under strict security, but in recent years, he has moved much more freely and openly, believing that the United States did not have the willpower to be able to attack him. His atrocities include the deaths of hundreds of Americans and the attempted assassination of a Saudi diplomat in the United States, among other things. President Obama's former Secretary of Homeland Security, Secretary Jeh Johnson, stated that General Soleimani was a legitimate military target. I do want to be clear. The last thing that I want to see, and I suspect anyone in this body wants to see, is our men and women committed to another conflict in the Middle East. We want those conflicts to end, as does the president. But, Madam Speaker, today the world is a safer place without General Soleimani, and who would want him to come back? Despite the disagreement in how further to engage in the Middle East, in the country of Iran, be it militarily or diplomatically, the last thing we should be doing is broadcasting our plans to the enemy. By passing this War Powers Resolution, directing the President to remove United States armed forces from hostilities with Iran, a point that is in itself in contention, we are effectively telling the Iranian mullahs that it is okay to push forward with their aggressive posturing. Rather than stating what the President cannot do, perhaps we should be authorizing what the President can do. Last night in the Rules Committee, it became clear that both Republicans and Democrats agree that the world is a safer place without General Soleimani, and any war with Iran needs to be authorized by Congress. Seemed to be general agreement. Democrats want to maintain the separation of powers, as do I, but the question is, to what extent are we jeopardizing our safety? I believe Congress does need to authorize military action and maintain the separation of powers as intended by the founders, but we don't need to broadcast it to the world. While we may be divided on the need for this resolution, let us recognize the privilege that we enjoy each and every day being able to stand in this House and debate these issues without fear of retribution of our government. Those protesters in Iran did not enjoy that freedom. They cut off the internet and eliminated those protesters. That's why you don't see them anymore. With that, I urge opposition to this rule, and I'll reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Let me just respond to the gentleman when he says that this is a concurrent resolution here in the House and it is non-binding and merely symbolic. Let me point out to him that the law states clearly that this sort of resolution reins in the President. The War Powers Resolution requires the President to stop using American forces in hostilities if Congress so directs by concurrent resolution. Moreover, the Constitution gives war powers to the Congress, not to the President. And if both houses pass this resolution, it's a clear statement that Congress is denying the President the authority to wage war, and that the President must come to Congress for an authorization prior to further hostilities. And by the way, we're not just pursuing a concurrent resolution. Senator Kaine of Virginia over in the Senate is pursuing a joint resolution. So we're covering all bases here because we are deeply concerned that we may end up in a war inadvertently here, and that Congress will have no role in it. Again, I would urge the gentleman to read the War Powers Resolution. I have a copy here, and the accompanying report to this when this resolution was signed into law. The report, with regard to consultation, is crystal clear. No, I'm not going to yield right now. It is crystal clear that the consultation is meant prior to introducing our forces and engaging into hostilities, which is something the President even notified us of. And in terms of the President's exercising this remarkable restraint, I just have a very different opinion. Have you read his Twitter account? Have you been listening to him on TV as he brags about the shiny, new, expensive weapons we have that he'd love to use? The rhetoric that the threat to bomb cultural sites, which is a war crime. I mean, the gentleman may be totally at ease with all of that, but I'm not. And most of the American people are scared as hell of this President's rhetoric when it comes to potential war with Iran. All we are saying here is that we ought to stand up for this institution and stand with the Constitution and make it very clear that the President wants to go to war in Iran, that he needs to come to Congress to get that declaration, to get that authorization. At this time, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from Florida, a member of the Rules Committee, Ms. Shalala.
The gentlewoman from Florida is recognized for 2 minutes.
Madam President, I rise in strong support of the War Powers Resolution to limit the President's military actions regarding Iran. As a member of Congress, one of our most sacred votes is our vote to declare war. We therefore have an obligation to study the evidence and share concerns about the administration's decision to engage in hostilities against Iran. We have a duty to question its strategy or lack of strategy moving forward. My expertise, Madam President, is not foreign policy, but I know Iran. I lived there. I worked there as a Peace Corps volunteer many years ago. I have been a student of Iranian history and politics for more than 3 decades. There's no question about Iran's role in sponsoring terrorism. Soleimani himself was responsible for the deaths of hundreds of Americans and thousands around the world. He actively worked to foment instability across the Middle East on behalf of the government of Iran. Nevertheless, the President of the United States, in his response to Iran, announced that he would commit a war crime by targeting Iran's extraordinary cultural sites. War crimes. No matter who is the President of the United States, whether he or she indicates that they are prepared to commit a war crime, then Congress better step up and reassert its authority under the Constitution. We must demand that the President justify any act, and that's what this resolution does. That's why I support it. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Let me yield myself 30 seconds for the purpose of response and before I yield to Mr. Cole. And my response would be, had the gentleman from Massachusetts yielded to me for a question, my question was going to be, was he asking for unanimous consent to change the concurrent resolution to a joint resolution such that it could align and harmonize with the Senate activity and then, therefore, maybe accomplish something? But he didn't, and so now I would like to yield 4 minutes to the ranking member of the Rules Committee, Mr. Cole.
Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized. May proceed.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I want to thank my good friend, Dr. Burgess, for yielding. I rise, Madam Speaker, in reluctant opposition, quite frankly, to both the rule and the underlying legislation. As my good friend, Chairman McGovern, knows, we've actually worked together to try and expand and reclaim war-making authority for the Congress of the United States, and I would offer and continue to work with him in that partnership. I think that's something that needs to be, continued. I also think we have no difference that if we were to engage in a war with Iraq, it would require congressional authorization. And frankly, last night in the Rules Committee, I offered a process whereby we could work together in a bipartisan fashion. That is, let's just follow the War Powers Resolution. Let's go submit something to the Committee of Jurisdiction, which is actually the Foreign Affairs Committee. We have a deadline or a timeline laid out in the War Powers Act. They could operate within that. Within a matter of a few weeks, we would then, in a very bipartisan manner, bring something to the floor. Let's contrast that with how this particular resolution came to the floor. We got it about 45 minutes before the Rules Committee meeting. It's written in the Speaker's office, rewritten in the Speaker's office, and it's sent down here to make a political point, not to actually do something that would have substantively restore congressional war-making power. This is all politics. That's all it is. And the political aim here is for our friends to suggest that the President either wants war with Iran or has acted hastily and precipitously and recklessly. Neither of those things are true. Frankly, our dispute with Iran begins with a decision by our latest dispute, the decision by this administration appropriately to withdraw from the very ill-advised nuclear Iranian deal. A deal, by the way, that the majority of this House opposed and the majority of the United States Senate opposed, but President Obama went ahead with it anyway. What's been the Iranian response to our withdrawal? A series of provocations to which, as my good friend Mr. Burgess pointed out, the President by and large has acted with remarkable restraint. Let's just go through some of those provocations. I mean, first it was attacks on ships in the Gulf of the Straits of Hormuz and the Gulf. What was the President's response? Well, let's organize an international flotilla to defend these ships. He did not attack Iran. Next, as my good friend from Texas pointed out, we see strikes into Iraq itself. Particularly, we see an attack on Saudi Arabian oil refinery. What's the President's response? Well, let's not attack Iran. Let's send defensive capabilities from our country there and protect those sites. Then we see attacks on American forces in Iraq. What's the President's response? As my friend pointed out, let's go after the Shia militias. Let's not attack Iran. Finally, after that, when the president responds, we set another attack. And in that attack, as my friend pointed out, an American contractor died, 4 American services were wounded. And so, again, the president responds by attacking Shia militia. Then the next response, our embassy is assaulted. Thank goodness, no loss of life, but I think the president had had enough. And by the way, just after that assault happens, who magically shows up in violation of a UN resolution in Iraq? Our good friend General Soleimani. You know, one of the designated terrorist for 13 years, a person who's killed hundreds of Americans, wounded thousands more, not to mention the tens of thousands across the regions he's doing. Now, what's the president do? He takes out a legitimate terrorist target. In Iran, no, don't want to do that. Does it in Iraq? How anybody could have any doubt about the president's desire to, number one, strike at a terrorist, and number two, avoid war,
Gentleman's
I will never,
time is
ever
expired.
know.
Yield the gentleman additional minute.
I thank the
Gentleman may
gentleman very
proceed.
much. Passing this resolution sends, as my good friend Dr. Burgess suggested, the wrong message to the wrong people at precisely the wrong time. The president did the right thing here. He's acted in a restrained manner. He's endured, and our country has endured, endless provocations. We should reject this rule. Frankly, we should have a regular process where we actually go back to the Committee of Jurisdiction, and we should absolutely reject the underlying resolution. And with that, before I conclude, I want to do mention, because I know my friend is very sincere in his opinions on expanding congressional war power. No doubt in my mind about it. We've worked on that before. I look forward to working with my friend on that issue again. This is the wrong vehicle, the wrong place, the wrong time, the wrong consequences for our own country to pass this kind of legislation. With that, Madam Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
No, and let me just say to the gentleman from Oklahoma, I look forward to working with him on war powers and other issues related to the executive branch encroaching on legislative powers in the future. And I hope we can work in a bipartisan way and make some progress here. At this point, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to insert into the record a January 4th New York Times article entitled, "As Tensions with Iran Escalated, Trump Opted for the Most Extreme Measure."
Without objection.
I'd now like to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from New York, a member of the Rules Committee, Mr. Morelli.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I want to thank the distinguished chair and colleague from the Rules Committee, Mr. McGovern, for yielding me this moment. We begin the new year in turbulent and uncertain times, particularly with regard to Iran and the Middle East. Protecting our national interests and securing the safety and security of the American people must be the highest priorities of our government. I am gravely concerned the recent actions of the Trump administration have destabilized the region and undermined those priorities. Article 1 of the United States Constitution vests in the House and Senate the responsibility to declare war, to appropriate money for the national defense, and in doing so, to ensure no president employs military action without careful consultation of and authorization by Congress. That's why it's so important that we take action to reaffirm these responsibilities by passing the resolution before us, which I am proud to co-sponsor. The use of United States armed forces to engage in hostilities against Iran must come only after thoughtful deliberation and approval by Congress. As we move forward, we must all seek to achieve a peaceful resolution that protects American interests at home and abroad. I join with all Americans in praying for the safety of our courageous service members and urge my colleagues to support this rule and the underlying resolutions. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. At this time, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from Arizona, Ms. Lesko, a valuable member of the House Committee on Rules.
Gentlewoman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. First, I want to thank President Trump for making a decisive action to protect Americans. Thank you. The world now knows that Obama's appeasement strategy policies, including giving billions of dollars to Iran, is over. It didn't work. The world knows that when President Trump says we're not going to cross this red line, they know he means it. In Rules Committee last night and again today, I listen as my Democratic colleagues claim what this resolution is all about. They claim that it's about making sure Congress has the authority, exerts its authority to approve future war against Iran. But that is not what this resolution does. In fact, let's read the title of this resolution. It says, directing the President pursuant to Section 5C of the War Powers Resolution to terminate the use of United States Armed Forces to engage in hostilities in or against Iran. Doesn't say about future war. We do not currently have U.S. armed forces engaged in hostilities in or against Iran. If Democrats are serious about making sure Congress has its say in declaring war, they would follow the statutory guidelines as described by Representative Cole. They're already in there. It would go to the Foreign Affairs Committee. But instead, Democrats have chosen to short-circuit the process yet again to achieve a partisan objective. As a member of the Rules Committee, I saw the language of the resolution 45 minutes before the Rules Committee started. This is not a serious effort for such a serious subject. Here are the facts. Iranian-backed militias have escalated their attacks.
Proceed.
In June 2019, Iran shot down U.S. drone. Trump said, no, we're not going to retaliate because no U.S. lives were lost. Iran attacked Saudi oil fields. Iran-backed militia killed a U.S. citizen and wounded 4 troops. Then the Iran-backed militia attacked the U.S. embassy. Soleimani was a terrorist designated by Obama administration. Let me read very quickly what the Joint Chiefs of Staff have said. He has had 40 years of military experience under all different administrations.
Gentlewoman may proceed.
And he said, the trigger for the drone strike that killed Soleimani was clear. Unambiguous intelligence indicating a significant campaign of violence against the United States in the days, weeks, and months, and the administration would have been culpably negligent if it did not act. This is a man who has been in the military for 40 years under different administrations, and you're going to doubt what he has to say? I just say thank you, President Trump, for protecting American citizens, and I yield back.
Reminded to direct their remarks to the chair. The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to insert into the record a January 8th Vanity Fair article entitled, "There is no strategy. Diplomats react to Trump's erratic, narcissistic Iran policy."
Without objection.
And I would also like to respond to the gentlewoman by urging who read a couple of lines from the resolution. I would urge all my colleagues to read the entire resolution. This is pretty simple. Basically, it says that if we go to war with Iran, Congress ought to have a say in it. Congress ought to do what the Constitution requires us to do. I don't know why that's a radical idea, but if my friends want to go to war with Iran, they ought to have the guts to come to the floor, debate it, and vote on it. Madam Speaker, at this time I'd like to yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Gentlewoman from Texas is recognized.
The President cannot unilaterally go to war with Iran, nor are we safer since January 2nd, 2020, after having targeted and killed the second in command of Iran. The American people are in more jeopardy, as well as our troops. In 2002, I was here, and I offered these words from my statement on the floor regarding President Bush. Always a question of the greatest importance, our decision today, now in 2002, is further weighted by the fact that we're being asked to sanction a new foreign policy doctrine that gives the President the power to launch a unilateral and preemptive first strike against Iraq before we have utilized our diplomatic options. I further went on to say that our own intelligence agencies report that there is currently little chance of chemical and biological attack from Saddam Hussein on U.S. forces or territories. Proven right, endless war, continuous loss of life of our treasure, young men and women, and many injured, this resolution and rule are imperative to assert constitutional authority to ensure the protection of the American people. I yield back.
Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. At this time, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Georgia, valuable member of the Armed Services Committee.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized. May proceed.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I join my colleagues in expressing the will to have an honest debate over the War Powers Act, should the minority party choose to do so. Before I move any further, I would like to submit for the record a report from the Department of National Intelligence on Barack Obama's use of drones, an average of 67 drone strikes a year over his first 7 years in office, killing an average of 6 enemy combatants a week, wherein the minority said absolutely nothing about it at the time. So, if we want to have an honest debate about the War Powers Act, then let's have an honest debate about the War Powers Act. Why didn't we hear anything from our colleagues on the other side of the aisle about Libya when President Barack Obama took action that led to the death of Muammar Gaddafi? Why not Syria? Why not Yemen? Why is Iran individually spelled out in this resolution? The only reason Iran is singled out in this resolution is to take a political jab at President Trump for utilizing an airstrike to take out General Soleimani, a terrorist who was responsible for killing thousands of Americans, partner troops, and yes, Iranians. So while our colleagues are upset with the use of the airstrikes to kill General Soleimani, I would remind them that the Obama administration, according to their own Department of National Intelligence, conducted hundreds of airstrikes, averaging more than 6 kills a week between January 2009 and December 2015, and that is in the areas of non-hostilities. That doesn't even include Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria, which are classified numbers. So let's just be honest about what this is. This is another partisan attack against the President of the United States for killing General Soleimani, who was a terrorist in an area where the President had the absolute legal authority to operate. With that, Madam Speaker, I yield the remainder of my time.
I'll reserve.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Madam Speaker, let me just respond to the gentleman from Georgia, who I have a great deal of respect for. Let's be honest here. Many of us, contrary to what the gentleman just said, have been outspoken against unilateral interventions by the executive branch without notifying Congress, without seeking our approval on military authorization under Obama. And I, for one, was critical of his drone attacks. I raised issues about our involvement in Syria. I want to ask unanimous consent to insert in the record a statement that I made saying that Congress should reconvene and debate and vote on a resolution with regard to what the Obama administration was doing in Libya. So some of us have been consistent on this through Democratic and Republican administrations. So I take great exception when anybody tries to say that that we're raising this issue just purely for political purposes. For me, it's not. For me, I've been consistent on this through Democratic and Republican administrations. At this time, I'd like to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer.
The gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
I appreciate my friend from Massachusetts setting the record straight. The war powers activity, the authorization of military force, has been an issue that a number of us have been concerned with, Republican and Democrat, going back to the Clinton administration and activity in the Balkans. But what my friend from Massachusetts pointed out is that this reckless act by the President of the United States actually makes us less safe. With one act, he's been able to unite the opposition in Iran. Remember, they were demonstrating in the streets against the regime. And I heard from friends of mine who have deep roots in Iran that this has probably set back the cause of reform years, if not decades, in Iran. We are less safe, not more. I strongly urge the approval of this resolution as a start to rein in the President's worst impulses, but we must put additional checks by passing Representative Kahana's legislation to ensure no funds are used for an unauthorized war with Iran, and Representative Lee's legislation to repeal the 2002 AU.
Additional 15 seconds.
Gentleman has 15 seconds.
This is an opportunity for us to get it right and to take our friend Mr. Cole's, we can move this forward. I see this as a beginning, and we can build on it. But rein in this administration, send a strong signal, approve this resolution.
Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Madam Speaker, may I inquire to the amount of time remaining?
Gentleman from Texas has 12 minutes remaining. The gentleman from Massachusetts has 13 3/4.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. At this time, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry, a valuable member of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
I thank the gentleman. Madam Speaker, this resolution is insincere and unserious. It's insincere because this is just, we don't like the president and he took action and we can't stand it. It's unserious because if they really wanted to limit the actions of our government to defend our country and defend those in uniform, this wouldn't be a non-binding resolution. They would limit it. If you want to limit it, go ahead and do it. For the people in America that say, well, we don't know this Soleimani guy. How come we don't know him? That's a great question. How come they don't know? Well, let me introduce you to him. He got busy with his work as a terrorist in Beirut, killing 241 Marines. The Khobar Towers, killing Americans. Hundreds of American personnel wearing uniforms dead by EFPs, explosive form penetrators, and thousands maimed, walking around the United States, walking around the halls of this Congress. That's Soleimani. But you don't know him because this body, the executive branch, Republicans and Democrats, have sent their young men and women to war without dealing with this killer, this terrorist, because it was too hard in Iraq to deal with Iran, because it might make them mad. They might do something about it. Our colleagues say that the president is reckless without a plan. Here's what's reckless: appeasement. Appeasement has gotten Americans killed, has gotten people around the globe killed because of this guy. What's the point of designating him a terrorist if you're not going to do anything about it? Doing the bidding of Iran on this floor is unacceptable. We don't want to be in, a war. That's true. Nobody wants to be in a war, but I got a news flash for everybody. Iran slapped us in the face in 1979, and they've been fighting with us ever since. Us saying that we're not going to defend ourselves does not stop Iran from fighting the war that they have with us. Appeasing Iran will only kill more Americans. It hasn't worked. And that's what's happening here today, Madam Speaker, the defense of the appeasement strategy of the last administration and administrations in the past. We cannot allow this strategy to continue and Americans to be killed or Iran to have a nuclear weapon, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I would just urge my colleagues to read the resolution. This is about the future, and it's about whether or not, if we go to war with Iran, whether or not Congress upholds its constitutional responsibility. At this time, I'd like to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Vermont, Mr. Welsh.
Recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman. The president's policy towards Iran is to tear up diplomacy and embrace so-called maximum pressure. The most recent strike, far from making us safer, is making us more insecure. Think about the deliberate consequences from that act. One, Iraqi Street is demonstrating against the U.S., not against Iran, as they were before. Two, the Iranian Street is demonstrating with the mullahs against the U.S. instead of against their own government. Three, the Iraqi parliament voted to expel the United States from Iraq, jeopardizing our anti-ISIS mission. Number four, our military has suspended training for anti-ISIS activities in Iraq because of this strike. Number four, the Iran nuclear deal that the president tore up but Iranians complied with, they are now renouncing. So we are closer to a nuclear Iran than we were before. All of this has happened when the likelihood of Iran further acting, 15 seconds.
15 seconds.
Further responding is grave. the gun is cocked and loaded. We cannot go to war without Congress being involved in the debate and the President telling us what his policy is going to be. I yield back.
From Massachusetts reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume. Madam Speaker, if we defeat the previous question, I will offer an amendment to the rule to provide for immediate consideration of House Resolution 783, honoring the members of the military and intelligence community who carried out the mission that killed General Soleimani. Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to insert the text of this amendment into the record along with extraneous material immediately prior to the vote on the previous question, and I would now like to yield 4 minutes to my good friend from Texas, Mr. Crenshaw, to explain the resolution.
How much time?
4 minutes.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the gentleman for yielding. I rise to urge defeat of the previous question so that we can immediately consider my resolution to honor the hard work and dedication of the men and women who made the precision strike on Qasem Soleimani possible. This is an interesting crossroads we find ourselves in. After the successful response by the United States against the escalating aggression from the world's most active and deadly terrorist, Qasem Soleimani, our great country has found itself divided and unsure of itself. Instead of unity and resolve in the face of a clear and common enemy, we have division and self-doubt. What's worse, that division has been sourced from the leadership in this very body. While legitimate questions were raised, what authority was used, what was the reasoning, what sort of intelligence backed this decision, those questions have long been answered, clearly and convincingly. The President has clear authority, a duty, in fact, to respond to attacks against American citizens and U.S. forces. That isn't my opinion. It's clear from Article 2 of the Constitution and the War Powers Resolution. The case is made even stronger when you consider this occurred entirely within Iraq, a place where we already have a lawful military operational footprint. The reasoning is quite simple as well. We must make clear that the U.S. will not be attacked indefinitely, that we will respond, and that response will make you regret ever having hit us in the first place. The long history of General Soleimani's actions against the United States throughout the region and the killing and maiming of thousands of Americans' sons and daughters and indications of his future actions make this point even stronger. And as to the intelligence, our CIA, our Director of National Intelligence, our Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff have repeatedly told us that this intelligence was some of the best they had ever seen, and it removed all doubt that Soleimani was planning large-scale imminent attacks. These questions have been answered over and over and over, and yet my colleagues pretend not to hear those answers. After all, the mere thought of agreeing with and supporting our President is repugnant to them, even when it is the right thing to do. And so instead of applauding these actions that restored American deterrence, delivered justice to hundreds of dead American soldiers and their families, and severely weakened the terrorist organization IRGC Quds Force, my colleagues wring their hands and express regret and disappointment. Instead of applauding the men and women of our military standing in harm's way, instead of recognizing the tireless vigilance of our intelligence community, instead of acknowledging those who have spent years confronting the Iranian threat network directly, my colleagues in this Congress seek to undermine them. I take this personally, since I was one of those service members for so many years. This threat is not new to us, though it may be new to those politicians who have lived comfortably and safely back home, now casting stones from ivory towers, relying on disingenuous judgments and false premises to make a false, politically driven case to the American people. And so I offer this resolution today in order to right that wrong. I offer this to demonstrate to the American people and our service members and members of the intelligence community that this Congress does indeed stand by the decision to rid the world of America's enemies and those who seek to do us harm, and stands by those who made justice possible. This resolution simply states the obvious, that General Soleimani was head of one of the most sophisticated terrorist organizations in the world that already committed numerous attacks against the United States and planned to carry out many more within days. This resolution rightfully congratulates our men and women who disrupted this evil chain of attacks instead of wrongly suggesting to them that their actions were unauthorized and even immoral. Madam Speaker, I ask my colleagues to support this resolution and put to rest once and for all the false implication that America cannot defend herself when necessary. I urge defeat of the previous question and yield back the balance of my time.
Madam Speaker.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Wisconsin, Ms. Moore.
Gentlewoman from Wisconsin is recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, late last week, President Trump ordered the assassination of a high-ranking Iranian official while he was in Iraq. This action threatens to cascade the United States into an ill-advised, non-authorized war with Iran and is already setting into motion a series of disastrous unintended consequences for American security and interests in the Middle East. The president trashed the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which Iran was following, and that put in place the first real restraints on Iran's nuclear program. The world and America were safer under the JCPOA framework, period. Enter Trump, and now we see Iranian rockets firing, U.S. forces being pushed out of Iraq, and alliances strained as we all await further retaliations. Oh, history is replete with the misery befalling those poor empires who first fight and mistake that for might. This escalation with Iran must end. Congress must reassert its war powers authority, and I urge adoption of the resolution, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This time I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Kinzinger, valuable member of the Energy and Commerce Committee and the Committee on Armed Forces.
Gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the chairman for yielding. Sometimes when I watch a debate, I wonder what happened to the confident America that I remember, that, when a failing country threatens us, we actually respond with force instead of fear and run away. That said, this process argument that we're having is interesting. But as my colleague said earlier, maybe they forgot something. So I'm going to urge defeat of the previous question, because I think in this resolution something major was forgotten. Maybe they can recraft it, bring it back later, but that is this. I hear my friends on the other side of the aisle say that Mr. Soleimani was a bad guy and they're glad he's dead. However, process argument follows. But I think somebody's been left out of this. When I was in Iraq in 2008 and 2009, I operated mostly against terrorist networks of a different nature, but about a quarter of my operations were against terrorist networks from Mr. Soleimani. So these attacks against Americans, we talk about the dead Americans from Iraq. These have been going on for a very long time, and I was part of the response to that. But one of the most important things we can do if we're going to have this process argument is appreciate the men and women, not just of the military, but of the intelligence community, of the State Department, of everywhere that has worked to bring the intelligence to bring this evil man to justice. I heard somebody earlier say we should have just captured him. Well, think of the risk that would have put to our military. So maybe we should at least appreciate the job that they're willing to do. That's going to be essential. I often hear my friends talk about keeping the military safe, as if that is the end state of the military. The military's job that they volunteer for every day is to keep the American people safe. And that is exactly what was done a week ago in the death of Soleimani. So I urge my colleagues to defeat the previous question so that we can give you an opportunity and pass this resolution appreciating the men and women of the intelligence and the military. That's the least we can do after this debate on the floor. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Escobar.
Gentlewoman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. As a member of Congress, I take my duty to protect and defend our nation's interests very seriously. The President's reckless and irresponsible actions toward Iran have endangered our service members, diplomats, and allies, and they have worked counter to American security interests. Those include dangerous decisions to pull out of the successful Iran deal and kill Commander Soleimani, drastically ratcheting up tensions in the region. In the context of the administration's failure to demonstrate an imminent threat to our nation, there is no authority for such an action without authorization from Congress. What makes this even more dangerous is that the President has no clear strategy. Under the Constitution, President Trump does not have the authority to unilaterally wage war. That is why today I support this rule and the underlying resolution, which directs the President to end hostilities with Iran to keep our troops and America safe. I urge my colleagues to support. I yield
The gentleman
back.
from Massachusetts reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. At this time, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Waltz.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized for 2 minutes.
Madam Speaker, Qasem Soleimani, as we've discussed, many of us discussed today, he was a terrorist and a terrorist supporter. And hundreds of American troops are killed because of him. Many of them are scarred for life. And I don't think we can overstate in this body how gruesome, how advanced, how effective the explosive devices that he poured into his militias were. They were deadly. They were manufactured in Iran. They were put in place by Iran. They were trained by Iran. And they had the capability to completely penetrate our armored vehicles. Soleimani worked hand in hand, in addition to this, with Assad in Syria, a serial human rights abuser, and waged even chemical warfare on his own people, literally killing tens of thousands. And because of him, today, hundreds, if not thousands of families, including Gold Star families, just this past holiday, couldn't open up presents with their loved ones. No longer will they celebrate birthdays, holidays, because of this one evil man, this terrorist, because of his savage actions. And I, as a former Green Beret who have operated against these thugs for years, I am grateful to the intelligence officer, as my colleague Mr. Kinzinger just mentioned, to the members of the military who carried out this mission to prevent more lives from being lost. Soleimani was actively planning attacks in the coming weeks, in the coming days, in the coming months. According to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, these attacks were imminent, they were clear, and they were a present danger for our troops, to our allies, and to our interests. And from an oversight perspective, the president had a duty. He had a duty to act, and I, for one, would be screaming from the rooftops if he had not taken appropriate action. So again, I am thankful for his leadership to take this monster out. Frankly, this should have been done a long, long time ago, years ago, by multiple previous administrations. It astounds me that this is up for debate. So for those of you saying actions,
an additional 15 seconds.
For those of you saying actions have consequences, let me remind you that inaction has consequences. Go to Walter Reed or Arlington, or go visit the American contractor, as though that is some kind of term, the American that was killed just last week. His name was Nared Walid Hamid. He's from Sacramento, he's from California, and he was just buried. I think the answer for most Americans is this was warranted. It certainly was for me. I urge my colleagues to vote against the previous question and consider this resolution.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentlewoman from Connecticut, Ms. DeLauro.
Gentlewoman from Connecticut is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
The War Powers Resolution simply requires the President to consult with the Congress and with the American public before going to war with Iran. Our constituents held their breath on Tuesday. Thankfully, no lives were lost in Iran's retaliatory attack, but serious concerns remain about the rationale and the ramifications. We do not mourn the loss of Qasem Soleimani. As the leader of the Quds Force, he was responsible for actions that harmed and killed American personnel and allies, and I condemn that. But any U.S. military action, especially one that could spark catastrophic consequences, needs to be carefully considered, fully justified within the law. President Trump failed to consult the Congress, failed to secure specific authorization, failed to cite with specificity the imminent threat. In a classified briefing for members of Congress, the administration could not provide any specifics about what constituted an imminent threat. They couldn't tell us what the targets were, nor would they divulge any of the timelines for the attack. It is unprecedented the level at which this administration is seeking to obscure the facts from the Congress and the American people. The rationale is in doubt, the ramifications as well. The U.S. announced it will suspend our fight against ISIS. Iraq's prime minister and the legislature moved to expel our troops. The Iranian leaders announced they would no longer abide by the 2015 nuclear deal. President Trump's actions have dramatically increased the possibility of war with Iran and Iran's pursuit of a nuclear weapon. Today, America and our allies are less safe as a result of the administration's actions. Let us reassert the Congress's role to ensure that the president, any president, is complying with the law and it was not conducting lengthy military actions without congressional approval. Let us prevent another unnecessary war. Let us vote for this rule and this resolution. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Madam Speaker, may I inquire as to how much time I have remaining?
The gentleman from Texas has 1 minute remaining.
At this time, I'll reserve.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts.
Yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Maryland, distinguished member of the Rules Committee, Mr. Raskin.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 3 minutes.
Madam Speaker, thank you very much. The Constitution gave Congress the power to declare war. The Constitution gave Congress the power to appropriate money for war. The Congress gave us the power to raise and support armies and to provide and maintain a navy. Why? Why didn't the framers just give the president the power to declare and wage war? After all, the president is made commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy, and the militias, when called into the actual service of the United States, it would have been a lot simpler to say, let the president go to war whenever he wants. Why didn't they do that? Well, the framers acted against a background of kings and princes plunging their populations into wars of vanity and political advantage to distract their people at home from the political problems of the kingdom, of the monarchy. And our framers were emphatic that the awesome power of war, the power over life and death of our sons and daughters, the power over our national treasure not be invested in one man alone, but rather in American democracy itself, the representatives of the people of Maryland and Virginia and Florida and California and Idaho and Pennsylvania and Michigan and Alaska and Hawaii. That's who the framers vested the power of war in, the Congress of the United States. Now, the structural problem is that if the nation is actually attacked, or there's an imminent attack coming, the president may need to respond in self-defense. Madison anticipated that, and Madison said that might happen. The Supreme Court in 1863, in the middle of the Civil War, in the Price cases, said that the president can act in those situations. Lincoln embargoed and blockaded the southern states, and that was attacked as unconstitutional. And they said, well, he was acting against a real imminent threat to the land and the people of the country. Now, after the Vietnam War, Congress passed the War Powers Resolution in 1973, providing the president may engage our forces in hostilities only with a declaration of war, a statutory authorization, or a national emergency created by an attack upon our people or our armed forces. Now, under the War Powers Act, the president must consult Congress if he thinks that he's acting in imminent self-defense of the country. The president didn't do that. He talked to some other people at Mar-a-Lago. He never talked to the Congress of the United States. Neither officially, the Republicans nor the Democrats. He didn't contact the so-called Gang of Eight of our top leadership in the intelligence and security field. He did notify us, in fairness to the president, within 48 hours of his targeted killing, which many see under international law as an act of war. At this point, though, whether you think there was truly an imminent crisis, and this was something like Pearl Harbor, or you think that the President still has not given us a single compelling justification for why he did it in acting under imminent self-defense. You
Gentleman,
think it's more like
time
Gulf of
is
Tonkin?
expired.
Gentleman, additional 30 seconds.
Thank you. So whether you think there was compelling justification or no justification at all, it doesn't make any difference. All of us, everybody in this chamber at this point should say that whatever imminent threat existed, whatever emergency there was, is gone. And now this country should not go to war without a declaration of war by this Congress or statutory authorization, unless we are attacked in the meantime. That's the whole point of the War Powers Resolution, to enforce the powers of Congress. We represent the people. We should not be going to war in the name of the United States based on the word of one man. That's not the constitutional design. It must be the Congress itself. I yield back.
Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Yes, Madam Speaker, I'll reserve.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I want to ask unanimous consent to insert on the record a January 3rd CNN article entitled "Trump's Huge Iran Gamble Will Have Lasting Impact." And I'd like to ask unanimous consent to insert into the record a January 8th Washington Post article entitled "5 Takeaways from Trump's Garbled Speech on Iran."
Without objection.
I now yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Cicilline.
Gentleman from Rhode Island is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the gentleman for yielding. I rise in support of H. Concurrent Resolution 83. Our single greatest responsibility is the safety and security of the American people. And as the elected representatives of the American people, it is our solemn duty to ensure that our country only engages in armed conflict that is necessary, and that when we do, there are clear objectives and a strategy for achieving those objectives. The Trump administration has presented neither evidence that military action is necessary, nor a clear outline of their goals and a strategy with respect to Iran. Any decision to put American troops in harm's way should be debated openly and honestly, so that the American people have a say in their future. Nothing in this resolution prevents the administration from seeking authorization for future actions, but it does guarantee, as the Constitution requires, that the American people, through their elected representatives, have a voice in that decision. So I urge my colleagues to support this resolution. I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'll reserve.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is
I'm
recognized.
ready to close, Madam Speaker, so the gentleman can close.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Do we have that? Thank you, Madam Speaker. Let me yield myself the balance of our time.
Gentleman may proceed.
Madam Speaker, I was in the class of Congress that was elected right after 9/11, 2001. We came into office in 2003. After coming to office, through press reports and information in various congressional hearings, we got information that Osama bin Laden had declared war on the United States in 1997. I did not know that. And that there had been actionable intelligence, and Osama bin Laden could have been taken out prior to the attack, September 11th, 2001, but the administration in the 1990s decided not to do so. Now, yesterday, fast forwarding to present time, we heard from General Mark Milley, clear, unambiguous intelligence indicating a significant campaign of violence against the United States in the days, weeks, and months, that the administration would have been culpably negligent if it did not act, all in regards to the killing of General Soleimani. The President wants to keep the country safe. The President showed remarkable restraint, I thought, yesterday, and I thought the tone in his address to the nation yesterday was precisely the right tone.
Gentleman's time
Madam
is
Speaker, I urge
expired.
no vote on the previous question, no vote on the rule, the underlying measure. Yield back the balance of my time. But I would like to ask unanimous consent to insert into the record a statement of administration
Without
policy.
objection. Gentleman from Texas yields back. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I think what the President did was a grave miscalculation. But we can't change the past. We can only shape the future. And I have raised concerns about executive overreach during the Bush administration. I raised them during the Obama administration. And today I am here to raise those concerns about the Trump administration. I hope there is no war with Iran. But we've seen that developments can change day by day, hour by hour. And should tensions escalate again, Congress should have a say before hostilities are launched. It is really that simple. This should be the easiest vote in the world for members of Congress, regardless of what you think about what the President has done, regardless whether you agree with his policies or not, and regardless of your political affiliation. This is about ensuring that we have a say about what may come next. There is nothing radical about this. The Constitution gives only Congress the ability to declare war. Let's reclaim our power and let's do our jobs. My friends say they want to honor our troops. Well, you know, talk is cheap. How about honoring our troops by doing our job, by living up to our constitutional responsibilities? War is a big deal. We ought to take it seriously here. And I and some of my Republican friends over the years have raised issues with Democratic and Republican administrations about the ease in which they commit our troops to hostilities. Enough is enough. No more endless wars. Congress has to live up to its constitutional responsibility. Let's reclaim our power. Let's do our job. I yield back the balance of my time, and I move the previous question on the resolution.
Gentleman from Massachusetts yields back. The question is on ordering the previous question on the resolution. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
I request the yeas and nays. We won that one clearly.
The yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. Pursuant to Clause 9 of Rule 20, this 15-minute vote on ordering the previous question will be followed by a 5-minute vote on adoption of the resolution if ordered and agreeing to the Speaker's approval of the journal if ordered. This is a 15-minute vote.
The House this afternoon has been debating taking up a non-binding resolution which would direct the President, pursuant to the War Powers Act of 1973, to restrict the use of U.S. armed forces to engage in hostilities in or against Iran. This 15-minute vote here is the previous question vote. Republicans here seeking to amend the rule for debate today, to take up a resolution, to attach a resolution which would honor the members of the military and intelligence community who carried out the mission to kill Soleimani. They'll need 20 Democrats or so for that to be attached to the rule. So the previous question vote here, it's 15 minutes. They'll vote on the rule next, and the rule provides for 2 hours of general debate on this War Powers resolution. As this vote continues, we're going to show you some briefings from earlier today.